This interview is a part of the Oklahoma Historical Society's Oral History Program, Living Legends Collection. This interview was originally conducted on November the 10th, 1970, at the Oklahoma State University Student Union in Stillwater, Oklahoma. The interview is conducted by Mr. Rolland Kerns. The interviewee is Mr. Otis Wile. That's W-I-L-E. This interview is being re-recorded on January the 7th, 1986, for inclusion in the permanent collections of the Oral History Program by Judith Michener. There is some variance in the volume quality of this interview because the microphone was too close to Mr. Kerns. Therefore, the volume control had to be adjusted every time the interviewee spoke.
Speaking for the Oklahoma Living Legends at Oklahoma State University in the Student Union Building, Stillwater, Oklahoma, on November 10th, 1970. We are today going to interview Mr. Otis Wile, who was a sports publicity director prior to his retirement about a year and a half ago. Mr. Wile, is your full name Otis Wile? I'm sorry, I should have said Mr. Wile. Now, would you tell us your full name, please?
Otis Strange Wile is my full name, Mr. Kerns.
And where were you born, Mr. Wile?
I was born in the Cherokee Strip on a farm which Father had homesteaded just in the edge of present-day Blackwell. We lived there less than a year when we moved to Guthrie, Oklahoma.
Well, that's quite interesting, not too far from Oklahoma State University. What were your mother's and father's names?
My father's name was George Clarence Wile, who came to the strip opening as a barely 18-year-old, and mother's name was Strange. She came from Kentucky into Kansas, and then when she married Father, they moved, of course, to the claim on the strip, and then on to Guthrie, as I mentioned.
Were you educated in Oklahoma, and have you lived here more than any other place of your life, more time here?
I've spent my entire life here, at Guthrie through high school, then here to Oklahoma A&M College, as it was known then, in 1923, and have been here since that time.
You didn't by any chance know Mr. E.G. Green or Professor E.G. Green at Guthrie, did you, during those days?
The E.G. Green?
Yes.
I'm a little shaky on the initials, but he was a longtime superintendent there and principal and director of the orchestra and band.
That's correct, and later was president of Oklahoma City University for a while.
A wonderful fellow.
Yes. All right, you might tell us in your own words how you happened to get into the sports writing business, a bit about your education and background, and how you came to Oklahoma State University.
Well, to capsule that a bit, I was in athletics in high school, as many youngsters are, all branches of sports, and my interest was strong in that area. I also did a little reporting in high school for the publications that they had, and at Oklahoma State I continued in track, my favorite sport, and in sports writing, and later was editor of the Daily Oak-Legion, the campus newspaper. Then upon graduation I went to work on the paper downtown until 1942, when I moved to the college as a staff member, director of sports publicity, and it was in that position that I spent all my adult life and retired.
You were no doubt here during the days of Jim Spavital and that blonde flash from Woodward then.
Yes, indeed, they were here as outstanding athletes for Oklahoma State in the zenith of OSU power, the greatest years victory-wise, greatest years in winning honors in several branches of sports that the school has ever known.
Why don't you go ahead then in your own words right now and tell us of whatever occurs to you in your memories of your service here at the State University.
Mr. Kerns, I believe I would prefer to go back ahead of my time to the very beginning. I've done considerable research in publications that are available telling of the very earliest days of the university, and it would probably be more interesting than any memoirs personal of my own, although we might get into that a bit later. But I think we'd like to have recorded and see it recorded the very beginnings of athletics at Oklahoma State University, and in the state of Oklahoma for that matter. It's difficult today to envision the Oklahoma State University of 1891, the school established as Oklahoma A&M College. First classes met in the old Congressional Church with 44 students, and some say there weren't actually that many. Stillwater had acquired through homesteaders' gifts and otherwise 200 acres of land for a campus, but of course there were no buildings whatever. It was called Prairie Dog Town. In this second year, since the famous run had opened the central counties to settlement, there were few young men or women qualified for entry into college. The preparatory school, which was continued for several years, prepared the college enrollees for college classes. Athletics were no concern, although physical exercises were recognized as important. OSU's first graduating class of 6 men received their diplomas in 1896, and it's interesting to note that all 6 lived on farms in the immediate vicinity, all within range of the bell in Old Central's belfry that was used to call classes in those days. We might talk about some of the faculty men who, as the tiny school slowly grew, were most instrumental in developing an athletic program at the school. One of the first was Dean L.L. Lewis, who was aided by John Fields, also the faculty and director of the experiment station. Later, Fields was an unsuccessful candidate for governor of the state of Oklahoma, as you may recall. Dean Lewis of Tennessee and a graduate of Texas A&M had his DVM from Iowa State, and he came to Oklahoma State in 1896 as a 26-year-old youth. Old Central was the only brick building when he arrived, and enrollment was 130. And he was the first towering figure in Oklahoma State University athletics. Lewis Field, the present stadium, is named for him. Fields traveled with the football team to the first game ever played, and that was with Kingfisher College, a school no longer extant, played in 1901. It was an interesting situation. They had gotten together a football team out of the student body primarily, but with 2 or 3 towns boys, graduates of places here and there. University of Kansas graduate, a lawyer, young lawyer in Stillwater, joined with the college boys, together with a Washburn graduate. There were no eligibility rules, and there were hardly enough boys in school to form a football team, certainly not enough to form one of the squads the size of the present-day squads. Everybody figured to play all 60 minutes in those days. And they went down to play Kingfisher College. There was an interesting depot scene over at Orlando. Stillwater was 20 miles from the railroad to Santa Fe into Oklahoma City and Guthrie, ran 20 miles west of Stillwater and its pathway north. And to reach Kingfisher, the football team took a hack and a wagon and perhaps a buggy or two, and a few followers along. And John Fields accompanied them on that particular trip. And they got the 20 miles to Orlando, and while waiting for the train there to carry them south to their Kingfisher site of the ball game, they went over their game plan. Pretty late in the day to be preparing for the game as modern preparation goes, certainly. But Mr. Fields said that an interesting thing occurred there. One of the big old boys from a Payne County farm weighed in the neighborhood of 185, 90 pounds, which is about as big as anybody's football players ran in those days, occasionally a 200-pounder, said, Mr. Fields, is there anything in the rules that says that a big feller can't run over a little feller? And he assured the young man that it was not against the rules. That was just a penalty for being small. He could just go ahead and run over any of the Kingfisher boys he could. Well, it turned out Kingfisher had a much larger team than the Oklahoma Aggies of that day. And the lad didn't run over anyone. In fact, he was the recipient of getting run over, and that game went on to a disastrous conclusion for the Oklahoma Aggies of that afternoon. They had a little bad luck down there in that on the flip of the coin, they lost. And Kingfisher selected the goal that it was to defend. And their field was quite slanting. This is hard to believe in 1970, but it was on a hillside, and whoever had the upper end of the field had a considerable advantage. So Kingfisher scored twice in the first half, and then they changed goals, and the score eventually was 12-0. The Aggies were unable to score in their half of it, and Mr. Fields probably decided maybe he ought to go into politics and leave the experiment station to someone else after that contest. But they did go on through that year, and their second opponent was the Alva teachers, the Northwestern teachers of Alva, Oklahoma. And this provided quite a problem because it's so far out there in those days of inadequate travel. So they agreed to play the game in Perry, which is about 24 miles from Stillwater and not too much farther from Alva. So they met there at Perry, and in that game, the Aggies, who were learning rather fast, managed to come off with a victory. But they didn't come home that night. In fact, the game started at 3:30 in the afternoon, which is the usual starting time in those days, and played till just about dark. And travel by hack or wagon from Perry to Stillwater, 20 miles over the almost trailless prairie, was not advisable, and they spent the night in Perry. And they got celebrating a bit at the hotel at dinner. A few biscuits got to flying. They'd won their first game of all time. And the other guests of the hotel that particular night put in a big complaint with the university. And that's why there was no football on a varsity basis at Oklahoma A&M College in 1902. They were on a probation. The next time they played football and had cause to celebrate, they were a bit more gentlemanly in their actions. So the reports of the old-timers tell us of those early days.
This seems like a very interesting discussion of these old times, and it's quite evident that the situation and the method of play and the equipment and the general personnel of the team has changed radically since that time. So you might tell us, if you will, some of the other games that came on up through the years and your other experiences.
Well, interestingly, of course, the school had won no honors in 1901. Had just got started with what would be regarded as organized sports. They had no coach, incidentally. Some faculty member would volunteer, as Dean Lewis did, and he became known as Old Doc Lou, affectionately, to students, and as mentioned, the stadium was named for him in the athletic field. But in the intervening years, the proud athletic teams of the state university here at Stillwater would capture 31 National Collegiate Athletic Association team championships, and that's a total exceeded in 1970 only by the University of Southern California. The school here, the Cowboys, as they call their athletic teams, would take 3 bowl championships in football, the Cotton Sugar Bowl and Bluegrass Bowl. They would produce 144 athletes who qualified qualified as All-Americans or won individual NCAA championships, and it would give to the USA 32 Olympic team members and 10 Olympic coaches and team managers. So the years did bring honors, but the thing started out on a very, very amateur basis in every respect. I mean, no one knew what he was doing or knew very much about football. In fact, football was under fire a little bit, but Teddy Roosevelt, as president, made them change the rules so it was not so rough a game, and the colleges then embraced it throughout the land. I think to go back to 1904 would be an interesting experience to relate. It was the year that for the first time the University of Oklahoma and Oklahoma State University, then A&M, were to meet in football and start the long and storied rivalry that has continued down through the years. But you might put it down that the school year of 1904 and 1905 at A&M College was not going to go down as a good vintage year in football. The administration of Dr. A.C. Scott was in its fifth year, and the school was on the march in many areas, but the gridiron team that year would fail to score a point in all of its 5 games played. That's a record that stood through the years, and it can never be beaten, obviously, and hopefully it'll never be tied. But the longest rivalry in the school's history began that year. The intrepid Aggies decided they were far enough along to accept an invitation from the sports buffs over at the territorial capital in Guthrie to meet the University of Oklahoma football team at Guthrie's old Island Park on the banks of sometimes turbulent Cottonwood Creek. Oklahoma Sooners had started football in 1895, and by 1904, when Fred Ewing was coaching at OU, they had established the sport quite firmly and had begun their long rivalry with the University of Texas. It must have been a moment of licking their chops on the part of the Sooners when the Aggies agreed to play them a football game, for the Aggies had been beating Oklahoma rather regularly in track and field, which was a major spring sport in those days, taking them apart in that particular sport, winning the old state conference, various normal schools like Northwestern and Central and Southwestern and so on. So the Sooners, who had the big football going for them then, as they have had many years since, were glad to get that ball game scheduled. OAMC, scoreless team of 1904, lost twice to the Chilocco Indians. It's now in 1970 a boys' preparatory school. And they had dropped a game to the Tonkawa Preparatory School, now Northern Oklahoma Junior College, and they had been beaten 11-0 by Kingfisher College. So that was a rather disheartening prelude to the first of the long series of games with Oklahoma. We might describe very briefly the game with Chilocco at Chilocco as described to me by Rex Shively, an alumnus of Oklahoma State, who wrote about that particular game in a letter in 1945. I'm quoting his letter now. One incident I remember very well. When we played Chilocco Indians that year, they met us at the railway station with a hay rack to haul us over to the school some distance to the west. They had a band there that had played at the St. Louis World's Fair, and the music frightened the mules. When they came to a fill, which we had to cross, they turned and ran down this fill. Most of our boys jumped off, but our quarterback landed on his head and was unconscious most of the night as a result. Shively wrote, I played quarterback, and they just beat the life out of us. But to get on to the University of Oklahoma game played at Island Park in Guthrie, the territorial capital, we might describe what happened as told in the news story in the Guthrie State Capitol newspaper the following day. The headline was the most unusual one. It read, "Swam 10 yards to a touchdown." And the story Ed Cook, left half for Oklahoma University, swam 10 yards for the first touchdown of the game with the A&M College of Stillwater at Island Park yesterday, a thing which perhaps never occurred before in the history of football and may never occur again. With the ball 6 inches from the goal line, O.P. Callahan, who later was to be mayor of Ponca City, was back attempting to punt for the Aggies. And the pigskin went straight up in the air, and the strong wind, which was blowing out of the north that cold November day, wafted the ball back toward the south. The scrimmage for it began on the bank of the Cottonwood Creek behind the Stillwater goal. The ball was knocked into the river. Burleson and Baird for Stillwater, and Cook, Long, and Matthews for the university plunged in after it. Baird was first to get his hands on it, but he only sent it a little further into the stream when he attempted to get hold of it. Cook finally secured it after a 10-yard swim. The game was a one-sided affair, the university winning by a final score of 75-0. Cook made the biggest gain, an 80-yard round in for a touchdown, and quarterback Cross played well in that game. So on about that particular contest, I've talked to many players in years past who were in that game, and particularly Dr. Roy E. Wagner, who played for the Sooners that day, later became a physician in Stillwater, and became the team physician for the Oklahoma State Cowboy varsities, and was awarded a honorary letter sweater by Oklahoma State, one of the few men in history to be a letterman of both the University of Oklahoma and Oklahoma State. Doctor said there was a cold north wind. It was a November 5 game, and we just about froze in those wet uniforms. But we climbed back out of the creek and tried to keep warm playing.
Mr. Wile, these are very interesting statistics on the old records of the football team of OSU or A&M back in those days, and I'm sure that there are many better days that came on, because I've seen a good many of them myself in more recent years, over the last 20 or 25 years. I am also informed that OSU is also quite renowned for its basketball, golf, and wrestling.
Well, that's true, of course. The school has had, as mentioned a bit earlier in the interview, has had the most national championship teams of any school except the University of Southern California in the entire nation. And these have been won in wrestling primarily, that being a very strong sport at Oklahoma State since the early 1920s, and in basketball, golf, and so on, baseball, and other particular sports. We mentioned that Doc Lowry, old Doc Dean Lowry Lewis, his first name was Lowry, Dean L.L. Lewis, was the first real giant to appear on the Oklahoma State athletic scene, and he never got a dime for any coaching. He just did it on the side as a benefit to fill a need, because no official coach was hired in those days. But things came on, and several men's names stand out so prominently in Oklahoma State University sports that I think it might be well to mention them and give a bit about their background. Perhaps the first was Edward Clark Gallagher, who came to Oklahoma State from a farm near Medford as a preparatory student back just after the turn of the century. He was Oklahoma's and the Southwest's fastest human being in the 100-yard dash. He could and did match races with men horseback for 100 yards, and could outrun most of the cow ponies in the territory in his youthful days. Gallagher in 1908 was graduated from the school after 5 years of competition, including his prep school year, before he was eligible to go into college work, and he lived until his death in 1940, stricken by paralysis that made it a very difficult thing for him to do his work coaching in the last few years of his life, and yet he had 3 national championship teams in those last 3 years of his life. But he had many national honors before that. His wrestling teams, and he had never wrestled. They didn't even have the sport when he was in college. He was a rather small man, about 155-pounder, a great halfback in football with his tremendous speed and a fine track man. But he developed the sport of wrestling starting in 1916. It seemed to be a natural for the big old farm boys of that day who had done quite a bit of cornfield wrestling in their day, no doubt, while the threshing machine was stopped for the noon hour, and they matched their champ against the carnival champion on a Saturday night when that was going on downtown. They took to that sport and gained their first national prominence in it, winning their first national championship in 1925 in the AAU. The National Collegiate Athletic Association began its national tournament in 1928, and Gallagher's men from Oklahoma A&M won it almost every year. They dropped one to Indiana one season. They dropped another to the University of Oklahoma, who came along fine in the sport. But aside from that, it was Coach Gallagher's Oklahoma Cowboy wrestlers almost all the way. And then among the coaches at Oklahoma State, the first of real prominence was Paul Jones Davis, football coach. In fact, coached all sports. They just had one coach in those days, and he coached whatever was going: football, basketball, baseball, and track. John Paul was a fine coach in the years from 09 to 1914, and in 1914, through his work with the Southwest Conference officials, helped form the present Southwest Conference. Oklahoma State and the University of Oklahoma, too, by the way, were charter members of the Southwest Conference, but both since have withdrawn and play their conference competition to the north in the Big 8 Conference in these days. And after Paul Jones Davis came, after a few years, the All-American from Michigan, Johnny Malbatch, John Frederick Malbatch, in 1921. His football team surged into prominence and won a number of important victories for Oklahoma State. He was followed by the patron saint of Aggie football coaches, Lynn Waldorf. Lynn O. Waldorf had coached at Oklahoma City University and had a little experience after having left Syracuse, where he was a second-team All-American. And at a very young age, with about 4 years' experience, he took over Oklahoma State football, and he had a tremendous record for 5 years, seldom beaten, playing a schedule that included some Big Ten teams. He scored OSU's first victory over a Big Ten team in football, and his team beat the University of Iowa back in the season of 1931, I believe that was. And Waldorf never lost a game during his 5 years at Oklahoma State to either the University of Oklahoma or the other big rival within the state, the University of Tulsa Golden Hurricane. He moved on, however, in due time. The Cowboys weren't able to hold him. Wound up at the University of California after a long coaching career. He's in all the halls of fame. So Waldorf would be one of the giants in Oklahoma State coaching history, along with an alumnus from Watonga, Oklahoma, Jim Lookaball. Jim Lookaball came on in 1939, and it was he who gave Oklahoma State its first all-victorious team and a long run of victories in 1944 when they won the Cotton Bowl championship, in 1945 when they moved on and won the Sugar Bowl championship at New Orleans. Lookaball's teams had a tremendous 11 years and tremendous impact on the state of Oklahoma and the sports area. In wrestling, after Gallagher came Art Griffith, then Myron Roderick, both of whom were graduates of Oklahoma State University, and continued the sport, continued the victories that Gallagher had accustomed the school to winning. Ralph Higgins in track was another OSU alumnus who came back in 1935 and coached until his retirement recently, and sent the Aggies on their way in the track sport, much as Gallagher had before him. He had tremendous success. And there was Dean Clarence H. McElroy, who for 30 years was chairman of the athletic cabinet. Not a coach, but he played a very important role in Oklahoma State sports. And of course, then came Henry Iba. 1935 was the year he took over at Oklahoma State as director and coach of basketball. And he was to achieve tremendous success in his chosen field, particularly in basketball coaching. As Oklahoma State Cowboys won the National with Bob Kerland as their chief player in 1945, and they repeated as national champions in 1946. Toby Green in baseball, Laban Harris, a golf coach since 1945 through 1970. All of them towering figures in a sense, in that they brought such success to the teams they coached and to the school they represented. Iba had the highest honors of any when he was named in 1964 as coach of the USA Olympic basketball team. They won at Tokyo. He was asked to coach the team again 4 years later in Mexico City, and they won there. And now he's been asked to coach the team for the third year, something unheard of. No one ever coached it twice but Mr. Iba. And he'll coach the team again in 1972, although he's in retirement from his job at Oklahoma State. So there have been great men handling the sports structure at Oklahoma State University, building the all-around program and making their contribution to Oklahoma history. Some of the boys that have been tremendously outstanding were Bob Kerland and Cap Rennick, Jess Rennick, a Tishomingo boy. In basketball, they were both Olympic gold medal winners. The first of the gold medal winners, and there have been several in wrestling, were Jack Van Beber from Perry and Bobby Pierce from Cushing, who won their gold at the Los Angeles Olympic Games in 1932. And so on down through the years, there's been much to cheer about at Oklahoma State University.
Well, thank you, Mr. Wile, for a most informative and quite interesting dissertation on the sports history of Oklahoma State University. Thank you again.